This podcast is brought to you by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. By the Diocese of Huron, a community where families and individuals from Windsor to Owen Sound, Grand Bend to Port Rowan come together to worship and serve. And by Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be listening. We welcome you back to another edition of the Vicar's Crossing podcast. The Vicar's Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square. And once again, I'm Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Church in London, Ontario.
And a fine man he is too. And my name is Kevin George. I'm a priest also in London, Ontario at St. Aidan's Anglican Church up in the northwest corner of the city.
Getting a little chilly. I noticed you got your cap on. I got my heavy sweater.
Well, when your hairdo, for those of you on YouTube, for those of you not, when your hairdo is a shiny dome, you need to put a beanie over the top of it. Yeah.
Yeah, with the winter's here. Finally.
Yep.
So. Good. Well, it's good to be back together, my friend, and
Yes.
Good to be welcoming everybody back to the 7th episode of our 9th season of the Vicar's Crossing. So today, very excited to welcome spiritual director, retreat leader, and internationally known speaker and teacher on mystical spirituality and contemplative living, something I need a little more of in my life. So I'll be looking forward to talking to Carl today. Carl McColman is here. And Carl is the author of many books, including the new big book of Christian mysticism, Eternal Heart, The Mystical Path to a Joyful Life, and Unteachable Lessons, Why Wisdom Can't Be Taught and Why That's Okay. And Carl's approach to contemplation and mysticism is inclusive, it is expansive, and he's dedicated to exploring the common ground between faith traditions with a real particular interest in the connecting points between Christianity, Buddhism, pagan wisdom as well. So it's going to be everything in here, which is wonderful. So
yeah, he's a great guy.
Having Carl with us.
Fantastic book. And it is a big book. It's over 400 pages. It's a good book.
Yep.
Good book. We want to, at the outset, acknowledge that the land upon which we record these podcasts are the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoik, and Attawandaron peoples, and that these lands are connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796, and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. These lands continue to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors of our society. We acknowledge and respect all the gifts of those folks of the land, and we wish to use this platform and all of our platforms to find ways to work towards reconciliation, that we may walk together the two-row path.
And as always, we are appreciative and want to say thank you to our sponsors here in the Vicar's Crossing podcast. To A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. And again, our thanks to Dave Mullen for his continued support.
And a shout out to the Diocese of Huron, for which we both give thanks for employment. At least up until now, anyway, I'm still employed, and we are thankful. The Diocese of Huron is a community where families and individuals from Windsor to Owen Sound, from Grand Bend to Port Rowan, come together to worship and to serve. And we extend our gratitude to our Bishop Todd Townsend for his gift. I almost called him by his dad's name, who was also a bishop in his diocese, right. Bob Townsend. So he'd take that as a compliment, I know. So
good, yes, he would.
Yeah.
And of course, to Molly Maid, make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today, and thanks to Tricia Lister for her continued support.
Amen. Well, Rob, we finally got schooled. Our Lions finally got schooled. It says, you notice our sign is sagging a little bit this week.
It is.
We were Lions fans before it was cool. It's sort of gotten a little weak there behind me on the wall because we really got creamed in the Thanksgiving Day game. So
yeah. That was not a lot to be thankful for us Lions fans. Although we're still pretty cool, I think.
I think we're cool now.
So we'll take that, and we'll move to New Orleans next Sunday.
Yes,
and see how that shapes up.
And we'll get her done. We'll get her done.
We'll get her done. We're okay.
I feel like it's good. And this is a busy week for us too, because you're going to be hearing this probably dropping midweek, like on an unusual time. You listeners are used to seeing it on Mondays, but we're recording this on a Tuesday, which we normally do on Thursdays. And so this will pop out, this episode here with Carl, sometime in the next couple of days. And then on Thursday, our regular guest is Dr. Jay Augustine, who we were to have earlier in the season, but we had a communication mix-up, and so he's coming. So next Monday you have that. So you're getting a little bonus of us this week. You're getting like extra us this week.
No extra charge.
No extra charge.
This one we're giving away as a freebie.
That's it. No extra charge for extra us. In fact, we should be paying you.
That's right. It's our Christmas gift to you.
Yeah, that's right.
All right. Carl McColman is here, so let's bring him in and talk mysticism, contemplation, and much, much more on the Vicar's Crossing. And we are so happy to welcome Carl McColman into the Vicar's Crossing Zoom room today. And Carl, great to have you here. Thanks for being with us. And how are things in Atlanta, Georgia today, or just outside, I guess, Atlanta?
Yeah.
Right?
I'm in the Atlanta, the suburban wilds outside of Atlanta. It's a little chilly for us, but and it's kind of a somber day.
Yes.
Today is the day of Rosalind Carter's funeral. So so those of us who respected and admired her,
Talk about somebody who actually understood what it was. This podcast focuses on the intersection of faith in the public square, and you'd be hard pressed to find somebody who better reflected how you can live faithfully in the public square than both of them, really, but certainly Rosalind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, we're glad you've come to be with us. This incredible book on Christian mysticism, the big book, the new and updated big book on Christian mysticism. Big book because there is a little book, right?
That is true. Although the big book was written first.
Okay.
And so I was actually embarrassed by the title. It reminded me of the Stonehenge on Spinal Tap. People would order it from Amazon, and then thinking they were getting some coffee table book, and then they'd get this tiny little book, and they'd email me and they'd say, you got size issues or something. And I'd be like, well, I didn't come up with the title. So
okay, all right. Well, we won't hold you responsible for the title, but we will hold you responsible for the incredible content of this book. So let's begin by helping some of our listeners or viewers with language. You begin the preface of this new edition with these words: "Love is real. God is love, and God dwells in your heart. And this God who is love wants nothing more than for you to realize what is already yours, the limitless joy of union with divine love as you behold the eyes of infinite compassion, and allow that compassion to guide your own life into care and service for others. In the Christian tradition, mysticism is the spirituality of such a union with God, union that comes through Jesus, God made present in human form. The Christ, who is the sacrament of God, the Holy Spirit given to us by Christ, is the very breath of God poured into our hearts." Could you say more for our listeners about what we're talking about when we talk about Christian mysticism?
Well, how long do we have?
Yeah, well, I got a big pot of coffee here, so knock yourself out.
Well, first of all, there's a lot of problems with the language. It's language that I inherited from people ahead of me, like Evelyn Underhill or Merton or some people like that. Many of the people that we think of as the great mystics would never have used that language to describe themselves.
Right.
So you don't find it anywhere in Teresa of Avila or John of the Cross or Julian of Norwich or anyone like that. Mysticism is a relatively modern word. It only shows up first in French and then in English about 300 years ago. But the root of it goes back to Greek, and that language does show up in the New Testament, typically translated as mystery. So what I like to say is that mysticism is the spirituality that humbly acknowledges that God is profound mystery. And which, would probably make a lot of theologians nervous, because the reality is that we can't define God. We can talk about God till we're blue in the face. Obviously, I've written, my books, and I'm just I'm just an amateur, you know. We
Right.
think about, you know, the Carl Rahners of the world and,
Mm-hmm.
you know, people like that who, you know, have just incredible articulation of attempting to, you know, to speak to and of the mystery. But at the end, the mystery eludes our language.
Mm-hmm.
And we can say things about that. We can say language is inherently dualistic and God is inherently non-dual. You know, that's kind of an easy way to talk about it. You know, I was earlier today, I was doing another podcast about the English mystic Carol Houselander.
Mm.
She has this wonderful quote. Let me see if I can find it so I don't misquote her. Hold on here. Where is it? It's in here somewhere. Truth would be a very small and petty thing if it would fit into our minds.
Oh yeah, I like
Oh,
that.
wow.
Truth
Yeah.
would be a very small and petty thing if it would fit
Yeah.
into our minds.
Mm.
But isn't that what we try to do? The word theology literally means talking about God.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
we like to do that. We're doing that right now.
Mhm.
You know, I write books, you write sermons.
Yeah.
It's just, you know, who is it? E.M. Forster said, you know, Christianity, poor little talkative Christianity. There is kind of a
Yeah.
wordiness to our faith.
Yeah.
We pretty early on identified, you know, our God with the word logos.
The word,
and,
yes.
and we've been verbose ever since. So
Yeah.
so which leads us to the second thing I would say about mysticism. The first thing I'd say is it's mystery. The second thing, that same Greek root word also gives us the word mute,
Mm.
which, you know, the mute button on your phone or on your
Silence.
TV remote or whatever. It's the silencing.
Mhm.
So mysticism is an invitation into silence and this kind of recognition that because words ultimately fail,
Mm.
we are left with silence.
Mm.
And then, you know, a number of the mystics have essentially suggested that silence is a more reliable way to approach the mystery than language. I love it, you know, the Cloud of Unknowing, the anonymous author of the Cloud of Unknowing, who said, we simply cannot think our way to God, but
Mm.
through love we can meet God.
Yeah.
So, you know, we can argue about the head heart split and if it even exists and what that looks like. But you know, but the reality is that, you know, as all the great theologians and philosophers have attested, you know, the more we talk about God, the more we end up just, you know,
More
arguing with each
questions,
other.
more questions,
Yeah,
more and
yeah,
more
the
questions, right? So,
yeah, like
yeah.
Medusa, they, you know,
Yep.
or not Medusa, the Hydra. You chop off one head and two more pop up in its
Well,
way,
and I think that that's the beauty of theological reflection. And what I love about your book is it broadens the notion for me, because I think sometimes people have a preconceived notion of what a mystic is, or, you know, but I think that the way you write about this is we come to discover ways in which we all sort of enter into that mystery. Those of us who are at least feebly attempting to walk in the way of Jesus, whatever that might look like. You write in a book that mysticism is a story that begins, you just mentioned the mute button. Mysticism is a story that begins in silence and only takes on the form of language and narrative after the fact. We say that mysticism involves experience, you write, the experience of union with God or of the presence of God or something as extraordinary. And what I really liked about that little section of this book is you speak about you write about three of these things after the fact events, which I found quite interesting. One of them being the biblical story of the Transfiguration, and I wondered then if you could share with our listeners how you tie that together with a story of the intersection of Fourth and Walnut in Louisville, Kentucky, and Teresa of Avila, and how they all sort of weave together. Because I found that just beautiful.
Yeah. Well, you know, I make the claim that mysticism is of course, it's more than just a story.
Yes.
So let me add that little disclaimer. But the reality is that if God can only truly be apprehended in silence, and that you know, to quote John of the Cross, you know, kind of like the suspension of our cognitive mind ushers us into, I'm paraphrasing here, but ushers us into the most intimate chamber. There's still the question of, you know, well, what then? You know, how do we talk about this? How do we share it with one another? You know, how do we how do we liberate it from the prison of our own interior lives? And so this paradox is, I think you see it with Jesus and the Transfiguration. You mentioned, I allude to that in the book. They're walking down the hill when it's over, and Jesus basically tells his friends, keep this under your hat.
Yes,
don't talk about it.
Mhm.
Don't talk about it. And and you could say that's just the messianic secret, but I think that there may be a contemplative way of reading that that Jesus is trying to get them to acknowledge that you can't talk about these things.
Mhm.
But of course, there it is written in the gospel text. So
Mhm.
they do write about it, and of course, and then it was kind of got, and I think that there's some redaction here.
Mhm.
Don't talk about it until after the resurrection.
Yes.
Well,
right. Of course.
I think that,
Of course.
that
Convenient.
was kind of added in later, but
Yeah.
but the to justify the fact that we are talking about it now, here it is in the gospel text.
Mhm.
But so we do talk about it. We talk about mystical experience, whatever that means. We talk about ecstasy. We talk about vision. We talk about inspiration, intuition. We talk about silence. We try to even give voice to silence, which talk about the paradox of paradoxes, but we do. And so we live with that that paradox, something that cannot be put into words, and yet it is our nature to be creatures that communicate. Right. So back to the stories. I just wanted to kind of look at different examples. And was it Teresa I talked about, or Julian? I thought it was Julian.
Oh, it may have been Julian. I thought it was Teresa, but with the piercing of
with the transverberation. You're right. You're right.
Yeah.
I think maybe when I give retreats, sometimes I'll bring Julian in.
Well, they I'm sure both could work, that and that great intersection in Louisville.
So what I was trying to do there was to obviously take us back to the headwaters and to the story of Jesus himself.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the interesting questions is, well, what makes Christian mysticism Christian? How does that differentiate from Sufism or Kabbalah or Zen or Vedanta or whatever? And the secret sauce, of course, is Jesus.
Yes.
So so begin with Jesus's own quote unquote mystical experience, the Transfiguration. Then to quote one of the great mystics in history, Teresa of Avila with the Transfiguration, the angel. It's a very erotic story, literally plunging his spear in and out of her, withdrawing it in and out. And then Bernini's statue, she looks like she's really having a good time there. So you got that's a whole nother conversation we can have. But then you got Merton in 1958. I wasn't alive then, but I wasn't that long after. My parents were alive. My older brothers were alive. Many of us today still were alive at that time. Wasn't that long ago. When literally the story is that he's on a street corner, he falls in love with everybody, and he sees them all shining like the sun. So here you have Jesus shining like the sun, and his apostles seeing this, and then you have Merton seeing everybody shine like the sun. And of course, you bring in the theology of the body, that we are all the body of Christ. So there's still that kind of connection there. And then the stories, whether it's Teresa of Avila, whether it's Julian of Norwich, or any of the other great mystics or visionaries, just to connect the dots. Just to show that, yes, these kinds of things show up century after century after century. And and so when we say mysticism is a story, we're talking about an ongoing story that that maybe began with Jesus on the mountain of the Transfiguration, or you could argue began with Moses and the burning bush. Or Ezekiel and the chariot. Isaiah and the God in the temple. There's all these different kind of visionary moments in our history that that kind of represent the headwaters of this, and then bring that down to the present day. And another figure you could talk about is Howard Thurman or Carl Hauslander. There's a number of 20th and even 21st century voices that continue to report, and sometimes we dismiss these people as cranks, we say, oh yeah, there's funny little Clarence who always comes to church and talks about how he's been talking to Jesus.
Yeah.
And you wonder, okay, is this guy,
yeah.
is this guy,
Yeah.
did he forget to take his meds this morning?
Yeah.
I mean, we do that,
Yeah.
but that's nothing new either. You have Marjorie Kemp in the early 15th century, and she would go into the church and she would start crying, loud, sobbing, hot mess crying because of her mystical experiences. The priests hated her. They just wanted her to go away.
So that's about right.
You're interrupting.
So you're getting in the way. We got a liturgy to.
We have a neat ordered world we need to get to.
That's right.
Yeah, decency and good order.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Well, that's a good reminder to look for that person that's alone at coffee hour that you're ignoring because they were saying all these things about talking to Jesus last night. Maybe there's a conversation.
You never know where you're going to get it, man.
You never know.
It's and sometimes they are just kind of crazy. I mean, it's allow for all of it. So you enter into the imagination, and sometimes all you find is yourself. But sometimes you find an invitation to something bigger. And
so if we were
discernment matters. So
I was going to say, if we're going to continue to explore, as you say, Jesus of Nazareth as Christian mystic, one of our tasks you talk about is setting aside some of the unmystical ways that we're used to thinking about him. And there's a neat part in the book. I wanted to read this part for our listeners. You write in the book, too many Christians have weaponized Jesus, which is to say they have misrepresented him as a figure to fear, rather as one who initiates us into the mysteries of God. One very big example of this adorns the ceiling of the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C. I'd love to go see that sometime.
It's beautiful, but it's bad theology.
Built in the 20th century, a beautiful church, amazing mosaics and art, but in the north apse of the main sanctuary of the church, there's a mosaic of Jesus, one of the largest mosaics of Christ in the world. It hovers above the altar, representing Jesus as a remote figure of supreme power, like watching over the interior of the church, like a penny-pinching businessman, you're right, watching over his employees, right, eager to catch them doing something wrong. And there are many inaccuracies with this mosaic, not the least of which is how Jesus is depicted as European, Caucasian, rather than Middle Eastern. But as bad as this white-skinned, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus might be, what strikes even the most casual observer is how angry Jesus looks, seated in judgment over the world. His face seems filled with wrath. His brow is furrowed, his expression serious, completely devoid of gentleness or any warmth. So having us letting go of all those images of Jesus that have come down the ages that represent him as that angry, wrathful, furious, judgmental person is difficult sometimes for us in Christianity. But you make the case that this is not the Jesus of the Bible or the mystics. I wonder if you could say why this is so important for us to grasp that.
Well, and let me backpedal just a wee little bit, because there's also the Jesus who cursed the fig tree.
Yes, so it's not always without anger.
Right.
Yeah, he cursed it in a very polite way.
Yes,
So the fig tree, I'm sorry.
I'm so sorry.
You will never have fruit ever again.
That's right.
But the so it's it's interesting to acknowledge that there are many ways we can depict who Jesus was / is based on our tradition, beginning with the evangelists, beginning with the Gospels. And so is Jesus angry? Well, I think Jesus is angry at injustice. I think he's angry at systems of privilege. I think he's angry at how we hurt one another, how we're despoiling the environment. But that's righteous anger. That's the anger that is born out of the love of what is good. And I think when I talk about the weaponized Jesus, I'm really talking about the Jesus who pardon my language here, but who just gets pissed off at us because we're naughty.
That's mild language for us Canadian podcasters, just so you know. Okay.
All right. Well, I've got plenty more where that came from, but
carry on.
So, all right. But but yeah, I mean, is Jesus? I mean, here in the United States, you'll see a bumper sticker that says Jesus is coming, and boy, is he pissed.
Yeah.
Which is, it's,
Well,
I
yeah,
think it's funny too.
he may be pissed at
The question is what is
the yeah, they're not sure. I think the people with the bumper stickers though don't understand what he's really pissed about.
So, to me, the story that really has to be told is that story from John 8 with the woman caught with adultery. And yeah, Jesus is pissed, but he's pissed at the men who are trying to hurt her.
Right.
Yeah. And then when they finally leave, he's just so tender to her.
Right.
And he's like, whatever it is you're doing, why don't you stop? Whether she was involved in sex work or whether she was just, sleeping with somebody she shouldn't have been, or whatever, it sounds like you're in a bad situation. It sounds like you need to get out of it. I mean, that's what I honestly believe he was saying. Of course, it comes down to us as go and sin no more. Which, but, he heals the little girl, and the first thing he says is, let's get her something to eat. There is so much tenderness in Jesus, the man. And I think what happens is then you get him cranked up about the Pharisees, and he starts talking about whitewashed tombs and dens of vipers. Yeah, but he's angry at people who use their privilege to hurt or marginalize other people. That's what gets his dander up, and that's what gets lost.
Right.
And so, so maybe I'm being a little one-sided there, but of course I'm trying to make the point that if your image of Jesus is that angry, PO Jesus that you see in the National Shrine in Washington, D.C., you're going to want to keep him as far from yourself as you possibly can.
Yeah.
A friend of mine who's a Mennonite pastor.
What's the sign I see when I'm traveling the interstates in the U.S.? Prepare to meet thy God.
Yeah. Or if you die today, will you end up in heaven or hell?
Yeah.
And that is not a question that is being asked to invite somebody deeper into love. That's a question that's being asked to try to make somebody feel anxiety or fear.
Sorry, I cut you off there. You were about to tell us about the Mennonite friend.
My Mennonite pastor friend who says, many people watch God the way the mouse watches the cat. And I think that's very, very insightful. If God is over there, then I want to be
over here. Yeah,
the opposite corner. So it's like I'm going to.
And I encounter so many people in parish ministry that did grow up with the God is going to get you, background. But that's what it was all about. I'm here in this pew because if I don't, God's going to get me.
Well, and I think that the I think that there's a level on which that has worked. I'm thinking about in the Roman Catholic tradition and the idea that missing Mass is a mortal sin.
Right.
And so there is a certain segment in the Catholic community that never misses a Mass.
Yeah, I'm married to one.
But then what happens? Then they do miss a Mass because they have a cold, they got COVID or something, and then they go to confession because they are so racked with a feeling of remorse or guilt. And so it's, and their grandkids want nothing to do with it.
Exactly.
Well, there's the big one.
Pops up too.
Yeah. So I think this is the challenge that we're facing here, is that if Christianity, if the way Christianity operates is by scaring the hell out of people, all puns intended.
Yeah.
I think it's reaching the end of its sell-by date.
So to interject with a question here that's not on our little sheet, but as you say that, it just pops in my mind. As you said, the grandkids are not interested in it. But what's your sense of grandkids' interest in the mystery?
Well, it's like anything else. I mean, that's a complex topic. It's fashionable for people who are actively involved in the church. It's fashionable to kind of look down one's nose at the person who says I'm spiritual but not religious. That's a cop-out. That's just, they're lazy, they're individualistic, narcissistic, yada 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 yada.
Right. Yeah.
I think that there are many complex reasons why we're seeing the transition that we are in the middle of. And I think a lot of it has to do that our culture has become an entertainment culture. and Christianity doesn't know how to function within an entertainment culture.
Mm-hmm.
We are in late capitalism. I'm in the middle of a social media thread right now with a priest in England who is absolutely implacably hostile to any kind of exchange of money. A spiritual director who charges is guilty of simony.
Oh,
you know?
Man, yeah, he's onto it then.
And of course, how I want to reply to him is, well, gee, so it's good to hear that you don't take a salary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I mean, this
Exactly.
is the thing. So again, not trying to pick on that particular priest.
No,
I mean,
I
he's
got you.
entitled to his opinion. But
Yeah.
by the larger point is that I don't, the church as we inherited it comes out of an agrarian culture. We're not an agrarian culture. We've gone from
No.
agrarian to industrial to service to post-industrial to who knows what is coming down the pike next.
Yeah.
And so it's like the institution doesn't know how to function in this world. So, so back to young people. Are young people interested in mysticism? Well, some certainly are, but I don't think it's, Karl Rahner's The Christian of the Future will be a mystic or will not exist at all. I don't think the salvation of institutional Christianity is to talk all the next generation into becoming mystics. Frankly, I think mysticism has always been marginal in the church and probably always will be marginal in an institutional setting because it doesn't institutionalize.
Yeah, it's sort of not that, isn't it?
Yeah. It's kind of the opposite of institutionalization. And so I think but here's the reality. You talk to a 20-year-old today, somebody who was born after the millennium, and you say, let's talk about mysticism. They're going to want to talk about the Dalai Lama. They're going to want to talk about Kabbalah. They're going to want to talk about witchcraft, and I don't mean by witchcraft, voodoo dolls. I mean, herbalism, and the rhythms of nature and that kind of thing. There is and I just realized what I just said could sound racist, and for that I apologize. I do not mean to cause any harm. That traditional African religion has its own beauty and logic, and my comment was very dismissive, and I apologize. So that's really important to say. It's like we're not playing by the same rules that maybe our parents or grandparents played by. And so I think that young people are very, very interested in the mystery, but they're interested in it from a global perspective.
Right.
If you can Google it, it's
it's good.
Right.
It can be part
and
of it.
And having a conversation with them and listening to what they're saying will tell you what they're interested in. Often we get sometimes we get barriers up that we're waiting for them to say the thing that we need them to say instead of just listening to how they're describing things, and you can key in on that.
Well, and it's funny because I, like so many people, I have a fraught relationship with the institution. And
so do we, and we get paid by it.
Well, I get indirectly paid. I get honorariums. You get a paycheck. There's not that much difference. But
no, it's true.
Except I have to pay my own taxes. But,
I guess.
But
we pay our own taxes too.
Yeah, well,
at least in Canada we do.
Well, in America, it gets taken out of your paycheck. Whereas if you get an honorarum, you have
I see what you mean. Yeah. They deduct it from us. Yeah.
You have to write a check to the
I got you.
Yeah. You're right. You're paying it one way or the other.
They're getting us. They're getting us.
So even those of us who our livelihoods depend on the institution, oftentimes have fraught relationships with it. Sure. But what I always go back to is that the teachings of Jesus are teachings that challenge me to live more fully.
That's right.
And so that, to me, that's where the conversation needs to be. Whether it's a conversation about mysticism, the conversation about the church, conversation about young people and their faith, or whatever. If we want to have a Christian conversation, let's let Jesus do at least some, if not all, the talking.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to ask you a bit about sacraments.
Yes.
Because you're right about that too, Kevin. And I, part of a Eucharistic tradition in the Anglican Church, and great importance of the sacrament of Holy Communion. We hold a baptism as a primary sacrament as well, marriage, confirmation, ordination, reconciliation. And you write about these sacraments in the book as important in this conversation about Christian mysticism. And you write about the sacraments as a conscious experience of the presence of God, not just a nice, cozy feeling that God exists and therefore all is right in the world, but a feel it in your bones, more real than real encounter with God's here and now presence. These sacramental encounters paradoxically point to something more profound than mere human experience. Yeah, that's so powerful. What if you could just say more about that, Carl, and sacraments and that?
A lot of people, including myself, will, to give you kind of like that little 5-cent definition of mysticism, will say mysticism is the spirituality that emphasizes the experience of God. But here's the thing. If we take our faith seriously, we know that God's presence in our lives doesn't always reveal itself through a felt experience. I love the story of Moses, asking to see God, and God's like, look, if I showed you my face, you'd explode. So let's just not go there. I'm going to hide you in the cleft of the rock, and you get to see me as I walk on by. How I interpret that, and how mystics before me, it's not my original thought, is that we can only truly see God in retrospect. Which takes us back to when you're in the mystical experience, language falls away. You're in pure presence. You can't articulate it. And then afterwards you try to, with varying degrees of success. But that train left without me, friends. I don't know where.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to know it's not just me that doesn't catch the train half the
time. So remind me again the question, and I'll see if I can pick it up.
About
we're talking about
sacraments
and mysticism.
The sacraments.
Presence of God.
So here's the deal. I certainly have, and I imagine anybody who has a weekly relationship with the Eucharist, sooner or later, you get your host, you get your sip of wine, and it's like, oh my God, I'm crying. It's so beautiful. It's such an amazing, wonderful, intimate sense of being loved and being fed and being cared for. And yes, God is present. I have no idea what real presence means, but whatever it means, I believe it because I've just experienced it. That's beautiful. But let's be real. 99% of the time,
yes,
you get your little taste of bread and your little taste of wine, and you go back to the church. And you're wondering where are we going for brunch?
Yeah. Yeah.
God is just as present. You have experienced the miracle. Look, I'm using that word. You've experienced the miracle just as much in both of those scenarios. So the danger of talking about mysticism and experience is that we then start to judge our relationship with God on the basis of our feelings. And our feelings, anybody who knows cognitive psychology knows that feelings are often related to our thoughts, our beliefs, our dogmas, many of which are subconscious.
Right.
So, and this is why you read, the Spanish mystics, John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, and they go on and on and on about, is an experience really from God, or could it be from the devil, or could it just be your own imagination? And you might say, that's kind of, it's there's kind of scrupulosity going on here. There's like they're worrying a little bit too much. But I think what they're trying to remind us is to hold our experiences lightly and to hold our lack of experience lightly.
It's like we almost need it to be something numinous in order to believe that it's in some way mystical, right?
Yeah.
That's the entertainment culture that you're talking about, Carl. It's got to be the big splash, right?
Well, and
I got to fall over when I get my host and fall backwards, and
oh my God, speaking in tongues and being slain in the spirit, and and all that. Hey, and I've been there. Okay, again, no judgment. I know that's so meaningful for so many people, but there is kind of an overwrought quality to it. It's fascinating, how many people I know who kind of, myself included, who kind of started out in the charismatic world, and as they mature in their faith, get drawn more and more and more to silence. And I think it's just there comes this point where you realize, this is going to be an off the wall analogy, but I've been doing a lot of research lately into psychedelics. The use of psychedelics as a therapeutic tool is fascinates me to no end.
Yeah.
But, so Ram Dass, I've gotten to know his work really well, and here was a man who ate LSD like it was candy.
Yeah.
And there came a point where he realized, guess what? I always come down. The high never lasts.
Right.
12 hours later, I'm going to be sober again.
Yeah.
And so what did he do? He went to India.
Yeah.
And he was looking for, what is there that's beyond just the experience?
Right.
And of course, he begins, if you read Be Here Now, you get, it's a very experiential trip he gets onto with his guru and so forth. But the fact that he stuck with it till his death, 40 years later, makes me realize that he got it, that it was more than just experience.
Right.
That there has to be something deeper than the buzz, whether the buzz comes from, a drug or from, going to a rah-rah charismatic kind of a worship experience.
Knowles, right? You write about the Christian, the future. Well, you mentioned earlier, Karl Rahner, the Christian of the future will be a mystic or not exist, right? You quote that in the book, and you outline several characteristics of what the Christian mystic of the future might be like. And among other things, which again, this has been partly our own sort of thing here, I guess, in terms of social justice. A lot of what we do on this podcast, we bring in a lot of people. And one of those characteristics that you highlight is that the mysticism of the future will continue to emphasize the importance of social and communal expression of spirituality, including the spirituality of seeking justice for all people. Many 20th century mystics were marked by and remarkable for their emphasis on the relationship between mysticism and social justice. And you're right, although this pairing has roots from far earlier in Christian history, Quakers, for example, have long recognized the essential connection between mystical spirituality and the efforts to make the world a better place. The 20th century represented a blossoming of what Richard Rohr calls action and contemplation, the recognition that the interior spirituality and the external work to foster greater mercy and justice intimately depend on each other. Can you say more about that interdependence and the future Christian mystic?
Yeah. Well, and I think it's because as I look at who, not all, but many of the key voices over the last 100 years, people like Simone Weil, Merton, Howard Thurman, you mentioned Richard Rohr, there's certainly others, but this just shows up again and again and again. So that's the first thing. The second thing, back to our young people who aren't bothering to go to church.
Yeah.
But guess what? They're showing up at Black Lives Matter rallies.
Right. That's right.
Yeah. And so, so there is this kind of recognition for many people who are steeped in the teachings of Jesus, and Jesus, of course, himself steeped in the Jewish tradition, that, that if you're going to be in a relationship with God, God is the original, God is the ground zero of agitation for justice.
Right.
And so, it's back to, we're back to the experience conversation. If I have an experience of union with God, whether it's Merton on the street corner or Teresa of Avila or whatever, it's kind of like Ram Dass taking his LSD.
That's right.
Then you come down from the high. Then what?
And it's true. And it's
make a difference in your life.
And we see it in the environmental activism too, right? Like for a lot of these young people, their spirituality and their environmental response are intimately connected.
And I think, the shadow side of that is that first of all, spirituality without a commitment to justice becomes narcissistic. It becomes very privileged, very kind of enclosed, kind of ingrown. And I'll tell you, we see it here in America. And I'm sure
we have it here too. Yeah.
But then the work for justice without spirituality, that leads to Leninism.
Yes. Yes, that's right.
It basically leads to that place where the only real solution is to kill the people that disagree with us. And some people may only be partway down that road, but that's where that road goes.
Well, scary enough, that's a lot of our political rhetoric is starting to sound a whole lot like that right now.
On all sides.
Yeah. And on all sides. Yeah. There's this, if we disagree with you, then you're pitched out.
it's one of the things I talk about, in a democracy.
Yes.
A democracy is built on the idea that there will be differences of opinion.
Yes. Yes.
So if there are differences of
Imagine
opinion,
that.
if there's only one right opinion, we may as well have an autocracy, may as well have an
Yeah.
emperor, and then that makes everything easier
Yeah.
until somebody comes and kills the emperor, and then they get to be the new emperor.
Yeah, that's it.
We've seen how that works.
Well, we see how it goes. Yeah.
But here, let me finish this thought. So democracy is built on the idea that there will be a difference of opinion. The people with whom I disagree, are they my loyal opposition, or are they my enemies, or are they demonic? And it seems to me in my lifetime, the rhetoric, certainly in the United States, has tended to devolve.
Right.
I mean, we used to talk about Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan.
That's right.
That they were friends.
That's right.
They got together and went bowling or drinking or whatever it is that presidents and speakers of the houses do when they get together. Can you imagine?
Not anymore.
Yeah, can you imagine?
In what world? We used to see the same thing here in Parliament. And of course, that is the language of a parliamentary democracy, is the loyal opposition, right? This thing. And they used to finish question period and go to what is Spark Street in Ottawa, and they'd tip beers together. And, I heard stories of a couple of great orators from Newfoundland, the province I come from, one being progressive conservative and the other one being liberal, and preparing for question period, touching base with each other, letting them know what sort of sarcasm they were bringing that day so that they could put on a good show, right? Like, but can you imagine that now? Like, that's not, I mean, it's all gotcha now, right? It's all like, I have to slay you. Like, it's
brutal. It is absolutely brutal. And and that's why, so this kind of loss of civility, this loss of kind of this recognition that it's okay to disagree.
That's right.
Is, I think, represents an incredible crisis point for our culture. And so, and it's interesting. I heard Shane Claiborne speak years ago.
Oh, I love Shane.
And somebody brought, I don't know Shane, but I've heard him speak a couple of times. Somebody brought up the question, this was an evangelical audience, probably very socially conservative audience. Somebody brought up the question of, how should Christianity respond to the question of, same-sex marriage or whatever the issue. It was an issue that involved, LGBTQ people.
Right.
And Shane, to his credit, I mean, I'm sitting there and I'm just thinking, oh, he's either going to piss off everybody in the audience or he's going to piss me off. Let's see. And to his credit, he avoided answering this, because the person was wanting him to take a stand. And he said, but he said several things that were worth saying, but the one that I'm thinking of right now, he said, Christians need to learn how to disagree.
Yeah. Right. Amen.
Now, okay, let me footnote that I personally believe that when it comes to the question of marriage equality, that it's beyond the question of disagreement.
Yeah, well, there's this human dignity involved. Yeah.
But if we, policies, whether it's involving queer people, whether it's involving, economic distribution, I mean, whatever you want to say, if it's involving human dignity or justice, to me, you're either for it or you're against it.
Yeah.
But there's still this whole swath of questions of how do we spend our money? How do we prioritize our economy? How do we balance out the need for liberty and the need for shared values that sometimes means, like regulation, corporate regulations, for example.
Sure.
It sometimes means, there's a lot of room for disagreement. And it's like right now we've lost that. This has gone a long way from mysticism.
Well, I know, but important.
Except to the point that I believe that if people of radical disagreement can somehow come together and pray together, that could facilitate a more civil engagement with how do we discern where as a community, whether we're talking about a church or we're talking about a nation or some other, but so it's I mean, back to, it's interesting how I backtrack when I used Shane Claiborne as an example, and I realized that, frankly, to me, I don't think there's room for debate there. But this is one of the challenges that we have, because conservative evangelicals would tell me, you're right, there's no.
Yes, they'd say the same thing.
Yeah.
But meaning something totally different.
Totally different.
Right.
And so this is a fascinating question: is how do we bridge these incredible divides that have come up on a number of issues? Abortion. I personally believe, and I'm a Roman Catholic, I personally believe life begins with the breath.
Mhm.
But that puts me at odds with where
Yes, with the
most other
church.
Catholics are,
Yeah.
And so, but who I'm standing with are the Jews. That's
right.
a
That's exactly right.
typical Jewish
Right.
perspective.
Yeah.
So, so it's like, we've got to be having conversations on that kind of nitty gritty level. And the problem is in the meantime, we're getting fed sound bites through social media and through all media. And
let's go off into another direction. I don't know what's happened the last couple of podcasts, Kevin. I've got a question for a guest about sex.
Rob is obsessed. Rob is obsessed with sex lately.
I don't know why.
I can't get it. Carol, I apologize for Rob, Carol.
I opened that door with Teresa.
Carol, Carol, Rob is your stereotypical Canadian. He just can't stop thinking about sex.
That's right. Sex and hockey. What else is there?
So what hurling? Isn't there a place for hurling?
Curling.
I'm sorry.
I've done
from the South.
Now, Carol, I've done a lot of hurling in my day, but it's usually after too many beers.
There's curling and then there's hurling. All right.
Okay.
Okay.
So
I bring on the sex.
I got to bring on the sex question. Let's talk about sex. So some scholars have speculated that a number of mystics may have been what we would today describe as queer. And you write in the book, the takeaway for contemplative Christians and other mystical seekers who stand outside the cisgender and heterosexual mainstream is to remember that more than anything else, mysticism is about love. And the fullest expression of love naturally includes erotic and embodied sexuality and gender expression. For Christians who want their faith in Jesus to be consistent with the best human knowledge and understanding about sexuality and gender, at least some Christian mystics can be seen as inspiring examples of a spirituality where love always matters most of all. And I thought that was so well said. So is there a place for a positive appreciation of human sexuality within mystical Christianity?
Yes. And we have a long history of dualistic thinking.
Yes.
In our tradition.
Yeah.
And that has impacted the mystical tradition like everything else. So there are plenty of dualistic mystics. There are plenty of sexist mystics. There are plenty of mystics who are implacably hostile to even, what was it Augustine said, marital sex is a venial sin. I mean,
yes.
that's now I want to bring out the big dirty words.
Yeah. Oh, bring them out.
That's some fucked up thinking.
That is bullshit there. That is some real bullshit right there.
Absolutely.
So but it's Augustine who looms so large, and who and I'm not somebody who's like, oh, I hate Paul, I hate Augustine. I think we have to have a nuanced understanding of some of these gifted theologians who were screwed up in some ways.
That's right.
And we've got to be able to, it's like this whole idea, even the dichotomy between saints and heretics is a dangerous, unhelpful dichotomy. How about everybody has a little bit of heresy in them?
Yeah.
God knows I know
I got a big dose of it, let me tell you.
So, and yet I love what Meister Eckhart has said. He said, you can accuse me of being in error, but you can't accuse me of being a heretic, because the first is a defect of knowledge and the second is a defect of will. And so in that sense, I stand with Eckhart. I have no desire to undermine the teachings of Jesus. But because of my loyalty to the teachings of Jesus, sometimes I find myself at odds with the institutional church. It's complex.
That's right.
And then I could be in error, so all of that is true. And so, how do we sort through all of that? Well, through conversation. Back to the question. Joan of Arc was a cross-dresser. There are, that just comes off the top of my head. Teresa of Avila, it sounds like she was getting it on with the angel. You have, certainly you have Bernard of Clairvaux writing beautifully about kissing Jesus on the lips. So there is a lot of evidence. And then Polly Murray, who lived in the 20th century and who probably never would have called herself a mystic, but I see mystical sensibility in her work. She was primarily a political activist, but then she became an Episcopal priest, first woman of color to become ordained in the Episcopal Church as a priest in 1976, 77, somewhere in that area. After she dies and people are reading through her papers, it becomes pretty obvious that she was non-binary.
Right.
She didn't have the language for that. So she would call herself, I'm a boy girl. You know, she'd say stuff like that, you know.
Yeah.
But so you know, this just shows up again and again and again. We know that there have been people who are gender non-conforming throughout history. We know that there are people who have significant same-sex attraction throughout history. And you know, and Christianity has, for most of its history, been aligned with a culture that enforced a certain understanding of sexuality and gender.
Yeah.
And so the mystics, everybody else had to navigate those waters.
Yeah.
But I think that, you know, a queer reading of mysticism, and I don't know anybody that's really done a good, I mean, Grace Jansen wrote a wonderful book about sexism and mysticism. It's called Power, Gender, and Christian Mysticism. And I think it's a must read. The definitive book on a queer reading of mysticism either hasn't been written yet or it hasn't crossed my desk because I don't know of it. But that I just, and I'm not a scholar, you know, I write as a practitioner, so I'm not the person to write that, but boy, do we need that, because I do believe there's probably a lot of gold there for people to explore. So,
and so important now, like it's so important now. And I think what struck me reading your stuff there was just that I think sometimes we don't name these things out loud, although now there are voices like your own and others that are writing about these things. But I think for people within the institutional church, knowing that we've always had voices among us who are non-conforming, who gender non-conforming, who have diverse gender identities, who see themselves as a part of the queer community, need to know that they've always been here. You know, we've done a good job of silencing or pretending, but it's never been any different. Right?
Well, and you know, and just one more example, I mentioned Bernard, you know, making out with Jesus, but the whole Bride of Christ kind of motif, which, and most people, when they hear Bride of Christ, they think of nuns. But frankly, it was the guys who came up with that.
That's right.
It was Bernard and William of St. Thierry and the other early Cistercians who all came up with this language of the Bride of Christ. And so it shows up, if you look at the history of mystical literature, it shows up in male writers just as, you know, or I guess I should say assigned male writers, just as much as assigned female writers. So so there's a lot there, you know, that needs to be uncovered. And if you want to broaden the conversation just for a moment and talk about global mysticism, you know, then you've got Ramakrishna. You talk about somebody who is queer, gender queer, non-binary, you know, cross-dresser. I mean, that kind of thing. You've got the whole kind of two-spirit tradition in indigenous cultures. You know, so you know, many cultures, you have this kind of intersection of spirituality and alternative sexuality or queer sexuality that we just need to be having those conversations, because number one, it's a justice issue for who have been shamed and excluded and marginalized and are often the victims of violence. And number two, for people who are cisgender or straight, it can just help them to find some compassion in their heart and broaden their vision of what it means to be human.
Amen to that. We could use more of that. Look, there's so much in this. We could go. We got about 10 other questions, but we won't ask them all because of time. But I am going to just ask you one more, and that is around you know, you write about 20 mystical prayer practices. You talk about, I don't want you to tell all 20, but you say, how do I consent to God's action in my heart? How do I cooperate with the Spirit's slow work in my life to transform me into the radiant incarnation of divine love that each of us can potentially become? In other words, how do I become a mystic? And so you suggest, as you move along near the end of the book, around some of those practices, some of those prayer practices that can be effective. Maybe share 2 or 3 with folks that you think are good ways to sort of begin to explore their own connection with mysticism.
Well, and again, speaking specifically within a Christian context, number one, silence. There needs to be a relationship with silence. And, the easiest way to do that, I say easy, although most people find it challenging, is a practice like centering prayer or, Christian meditation, that kind of thing. An intentional meditative practice of silence, which usually involves working with a prayer word or an icon, following your breath, that kind of thing. It's hard because our minds are unruly, and so we immediately encounter our own, talk about, discovering your own powerlessness. That, I can't even find equipoise within my own mind. How do I, how can I make a difference? So at any rate, so silence, number one. Number two, again, specifically within a Christian context, Lectio Divina, learning to read the sacred text, obviously the Bible, but also other quote unquote sacred writings in the history of the tradition, the great saints, the great mystics, really significant works of theology, from that lens of contemplative listening rather than simply kind of cognitive, analysis. We are taught to read in order to get something out of the text. Right. Can this text entertain me? Can it make me laugh? Can it give me information? Can it give me mastery, skills, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And so we bring all of that to how we read the sacred text. But I think, the sacred texts need to be read more like poetry. That I read this for the purpose of encounter and for the purpose of simply being present with the beauty of the language. Also being present with the horror of the language. Phyllis Tribble was right. There are texts of terror in Scripture, and we have to be able to name that. A lot of Christians are really squeamish about that, but that has to be talked about. But even with all the texts of terror, so much that is luminous and that is inspiring and that can call us forward. But to open our hearts simply for that moment of encounter, I think is really, really important. And then I would say the third thing, and this could take several forms, but I'm going to say relationship. And what I mean by that is, that can mean community involvement, whether it's church or some sort of a ministry or habitat or something like that. It could mean spiritual direction, spiritual companionship, getting in a one-on-one kind of a relationship. It can mean a small group like a centering prayer group or a monastic oblate group or something like that. But we live in an individualistic culture. And so the danger, I think, is that we see our relationship with God individualistic way. And it's, at its extreme, I mean, that's have you been saved? And the rest of the world can go to hell, but have you been saved?
That is right.
And to try to undermine that with, hey, we are all in this together. And that being called to love our neighbor is of a piece with being called to love God. And so, and I think it's Teresa of Avila who said, if you want to measure the quality of your prayer, look at how you treat other people.
Yeah.
And so getting into some sort of, and I'm an introvert, and introverts love to be all by themselves, but for some of us this is easier than others. But the reality is that being in relationship with others, which means dealing with conflict, dealing with our own brokenness, our own capacity to get triggered, I mean, all of the above. If we've been traumatized, how do we heal that? If we have created trauma, how do we own that and try to take responsibility for that and see if we can repair the damage we've done, all of the above. That may sound very mundane, but again, I think this is what the mystics have been telling us from day one, is that God meets us in the mundane.
Wow, it's great stuff. Carl McColman's been our guest today, the new big book of Christian mysticism, among other things that he's written. So please pick those up. These books are available for you wherever you get your books. And Carl, thank you. We really appreciate you giving us this time and offering this to our listeners. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, I feel like we could do this all day. I really do feel like we could do it all day, Carl. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. And do certainly hope our listeners will pick up that book or some of his others and check him out on his website. Lots of blogging and things going on as well. There's the new big book of Christian mysticism. Oh, it's a big one.
It's a big one. It's not so big on my iPad. Oddly enough, on my iPad, it's very thin.
Thanks again for dropping by, everybody. We appreciate it. Special thanks to our sponsors, A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation, London, Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. Our thanks to the Diocese of Huron, and of course to Molly Maid, where you can make your home a healthy haven, and call Molly Maid London today. And we'll get on that, Kevin. And until we get together again in a couple of days with Dr. Augustin, we'll chat with him in just a little bit. Good to see you. And remember to always look both ways
before you cross the street. Oh, yeah.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vickers Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vickers Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!